Welcome to Hamburger Business Review. I'm Mike Merrill here with Zach Rose. Talk to you about all things hamburgers and business.
Mike is a podcaster. This is my first time on a podcast, so he's doing great.
I'm a casual enthusiast. I mean, it is a daily practice, but it's a 3-minute review on my other podcast. And I think it's just us having a conversation about something we're wholly fascinated by. It feels like it should be pretty organic.
That's true. Let's get into it.
The concept of Hamburger Business Review is we are looking at the glorious history of Harvard Business School's case studies that they've done throughout the years, many of which, I think there's over 30 case studies that speak to or something about McDonald's. And today we're looking at the June 30, 1993 McDonald's and the Environment A.
Is it 1993? I thought it was late November of 1990.
Oh, no, you're right. The revision was 93. You're right.
Okay.
Yep. It was. Yeah.
This is significant sort of news item that this case review is covering happened less than 30 days before the review was published.
What made you choose this one of the long list of all of the McDonald's case studies? I'm curious about what made you just kind of hone in on that.
Yeah, a couple of things. It was first on your list, so that was a good place to start. And then also the environment. What an angle. What a place to start talking about McDonald's from. And also 1990 environmentalism is different than environmentalism now, I'm learning. So it seemed like a great place. We're both of a certain age. We're talking about 90s McDonald's would maybe bring us back. I don't know if you had McDonald's as a kid.
Oh man, my first job was working at McDonald's in high school.
No kidding.
Yeah.
In Alaska?
Yep.
Wow.
In both Soldotna, and then I also worked at the Sitka McDonald's, which is one of the last McDonald's to have pizza at McDonald's.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're in this deep.
I
didn't realize I was working with a professional.
But from that 90s era, when I was in Portland, I feel like McDonald's was the symbol of sort of like corporate greed and evil.
It's the tall poppy effect. Like for every Coca-Cola, there's a Pepsi that's doing something much worse, but it doesn't get as much flack because it's not the big one that everybody knows.
Let's get into this case study because I have not read a lot of case studies, although I love the form, which is a little bit strange.
And I'm totally unfamiliar to the form. I'm not even sure what this is supposed to be about or why it's presented this way. I have a lot of questions.
I'm gonna say at the outset, and I think we'll get to this by our conclusion, that I think this is a poor case study. And maybe it's because it's as I said, the title is McDonald's and the Environment A, and there is a B. Which we are not addressing. We are only addressing this case study.
Right. Haven't even paid for the B. They cost $8 a pop. So
there's 3 great quotes that start out this case study, and I think they sort of sum up essentially everything that we're going to talk about. The first one is Shelby Yastro, Senior Vice President for Environmental Affairs, McDonald's Corporation. And the quote is, "Society has an impression on business, as it darn well should. And business better start paying attention to society." That's pretty good.
Okay, he is business.
He
better take his own advice.
Yeah, one would hope. Next is Fred Krupp, the executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund. "It's time to turn the golden arches green." And I think there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll get into that. This whole strange marriage, which is essentially what this case study is about, is this marriage between the Environmental Defense Fund and McDonald's working together.
Right.
And then final quote is from Ed Rensi, the COO of McDonald's. "This is the most flexible company on the face of the earth." It's a little bold. "We do what feels good, and if something feels different tomorrow, we'll do that."
I love that. And that to me, because I feel like the case study is trying to make this thing seem, they're trying to have some dramatic tension in the case study. I don't know if it's a business school, what would you do situation, or a isn't this unusual situation, but the author seems fixated on McDonald's spent like at least half a decade talking about how their styrofoam containers are actually not that bad for the environment. They're maybe recyclable one day. They're, it's
They're
not much
better
material.
than some of the other options. They're not destroying trees.
Right. And then the case study's author seems to be fixated on like, how could they go back on that? How wouldn't McDonald's lose all credibility? And this just seems so absurd to me. Who cares? That's what I can't put my head into.
Yeah, I think the mode of where we were then it's going to be very hard for us to adopt now because
I've been trying.
yeah.
I,
An interesting aspect of this is that the case study author, Sharon, I think her name, I don't know exactly how to pronounce her last name, Livesey.
Sharon Livesey.
Sharon Livesey she's now a professor at Fordham University. And I looked up her like rate my professor rating, and hers is it's a mix of good and bad, mostly bad because they all are. But everyone talks about how she's so liberal and so pro-environmental, and she's a real activist. And I think that's an interesting context to add as we go through and kind of think about like what is this case study trying to do? To think about the case study itself as potentially a form of activism.
Yeah. So the meat of the case study, let's just get into it.
Let's do it.
McDonald's introduced the Big Mac in the late 60s. They introduced styrofoam packaging in the late 70s for a number of products, including the Big Mac, including six-piece chicken McNuggets, the filet of fish, all these different products. And then throughout the 80s, it seems like there's a real cultural moment about trash and recycling, and the landfills are going to overfill. We're running out of place to put our trash. This can't go on. And so, like, very, very late 80s, 1990, McDonald's teams up with the Environmental Defense Fund and switches to a paper wrap for their products, which they kept for about mid 90s, and then they started doing some cardboard again.
Part where you're talking about the tall poppy effect and thinking about I remember seeing McDonald's trash on the side of the road, like those, the containers specifically. Like I have a memory of that. And I think that because you have this like iconic packaging that just is so bright and stays around for so long, I could see that being a major impact of like where a lot of the it's kind of the ire of the environmental activists are looking at, like, look at the trash on the side of the road. It's an easy to understand problem
Because it's branded.
and it's visual and it's right there. Yeah.
Right, right. And it's so ugly. When styrofoam gets dirty, it's just the ugliest thing in the world.
Yep, absolutely. Some of the history and some of the like going through the case study, we kind of start out with this overview that kind of talks about there was pressure on McDonald's to do something about this. It talked about the Los Angeles Mayor Bradley, kind of like saying, oh, this is so great that they're getting rid of this trash. Politicians are going to back something that shows a noticeable visual change. But this thing of teaming up with the EDF in order to find the solution, I think that's the real point that we're looking at in this case study, because I think that's the unusual thing. Normally, a company would do this on its own and would never align itself with another organization, especially one that's, the Environmental Defense Fund.
Right. And that has some teeth and some legitimacy to say, we studied this, we're still not happy with what they did. It seems like that would have really hurt. Could that have hurt McDonald's if the EDF were unsatisfied by the end of this 6-month investigation that they did?
Yeah, to come in and say at the end to say like, oh, they're actually worse than we thought, or like, oh, we looked behind the curtain and it's even more harmful, than just the trash that's out there or just the styrofoam or whatever it is. It seems super risky. And they talk about that in the case study where they break down kind of the rules where like, okay, they're going to work on this thing together, but they both have the right to issue different final statements if they want. Like that was part of the negotiation of putting this team together.
Right. They didn't talk about this in the case study, but I did find a Los Angeles Times article from 1990 about Fred Krupp and the EDF. And according to his telling of it, or their telling of it, Fred Krupp was like on a road trip with his family in Connecticut or something. They pulled over, they got McDonald's Happy Meals. He was looking at the 6-piece chicken McNugget box made out of styrofoam and thinking, this is after a long career of other many like environmental legal successes. And he was like, I should just talk to them and tell them, and start negotiations to get them to stop doing this. And he actually has meetings for a year before this study kicks off. And so I wonder, is this really a study, or is the study sort of like the result of a creative negotiation that maybe had some teeth with it, that was like, we need to do this together, or we can do this together. If you don't, it's going to be worse for you.
I do think that there is that. It's interesting that he came at it as sort of a friend of the brand, right? As a customer. He's like, I'm already feeding my kids chicken nuggets. So he's coming in being like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. That seems like a really gentle way to approach the negotiation. But through this case study, it's talking a lot about the potential launch of these polystyrene recycling centers that they're trying to create, and then that switches gears based on this study, and suddenly it's this dramatic shift to, no, we're just going to phase those out. There was this quote defending the use of polystyrene, which again, the tall poppy effect, where Shelby says, we use foam packaging for the same reasons that schools, hospitals, and other restaurants do. It keeps our products hot, it keeps them fresh, it's portable, and it's a safe and sanitary way to serve our product. And I just think, like saying like McDonald's, schools and hospitals, you're just like, this is the way it's done. It's not our, like you can go to any of these places and find the same trash. We're just doing it at a scale that is unimaginable to any of these singular organizations.
Which frankly, I don't buy it. And I don't buy so much of what McDonald's said in this case study about their polystyrene containers. They had the polystyrene in the late 70s, and the decade before that, everyone was complaining about the cold hamburgers? I don't think so.
McDonald's is a company that's built on efficiency at every level, right? So like once they figured out like, this is how we get our containers, it's super efficient to ship them, to use them, everything's perfect. And then to have somebody come in and say like, maybe you should do things in a slower, harder way. I'm sure they were like, no, we're not doing that. As late as 1990, COO Renzi criticized the critics, arguing at a conference of fast food executives, we cannot allow ourselves to be held hostage to self-appointed saviors who are just trying to scare the American public.
If they're so concerned about keeping the hamburgers warm in the styrofoam box, what about the fries?
Yeah.
This whole thing falls through. And they're talking about how they can recycle the polystyrene, and it turns out that like, oh wait, we forgot it's covered in grease and ketchup. And for every bulky styrofoam box, we're gonna get like a gram of the good plastic juice out of this again, or like half a gram or something. It just doesn't make sense.
What about the fries feels like it could be the counter to this entire case study?
What about the fries?
Yeah. You go back to the mission of Fred Krupp and the EDF, they don't care about the temperature of the food. They're just trying to get rid of polystyrene.
This raises a bunch of questions for me, like, why did they switch from cardboard to styrofoam in the first place in the late 70s?
Plastic just became the thing.
Okay.
It just became the default way to do everything. And so I think historically it was just like the rise of plastic, and then obviously like disposable plastic just became this magical solution. And it is an amazing insulator.
I can imagine at some point that even if it wasn't better, or even if it was just marginally better, there was a moment where it was like, this is new. Check it out.
Yes.
And that alone is like a quick hit for McDonald's profits, and so they're going to take it. Okay. I'm warming up to this. I can also see how the box would be very important for McDonald's to have their sandwiches come in a box, because any mom and pop local fast food restaurant is going to wrap the burger in paper, and this just makes it seem
A quality
like a new pair of
differentiator.
Nikes,
Yeah, yep.
like a real product, like something that like you got to get the new sandwich if you haven't had it already.
I remember having the pancakes at McDonald's as a kid. The way the fork would like puncture into it a little bit. It's an insane material. It's not a very good plate. I think the branding effect was huge, both from a kind of technology, look what we're doing way, but in the case study, they talk about the familiar pastel polystyrofoam boxes.
Each type of product comes in a different color.
I don't think McDonald's was initially looking for the real solution. Like
No,
McDonald's
I
was
think
just
that's
like,
clear. It almost sounds like their number one priority is just the supplier relationship that they have with the polystyrene people.
in the case study, they're trying to give a sense of like how much polystyrene is being used. And so they were saying that the typical restaurant generated about 238 pounds of on-premises waste per day. But the majority of that came from behind the counter uses. So stuff that the
Yes.
customer never sees. Polystyrene accounted for about 7% of waste by weight. And obviously it's very lightweight, but also most of the waste that's happening at McDonald's is invisible, and therefore we don't care about it. What we care about is the visual waste and the parts that we have to touch as customers.
Yes. And even the stuff that McDonald's is throwing out, they make the point that like, oh, well, actually, like, yeah, right. A lot of McDonald's orders are to go. So how are we going to recycle it? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so then they come up with this brilliant idea for these recycling centers.
The original polystyrene was the little bubbles of air are actually chlorofluorocarbon gas that is like, used as a refrigerant or was used as a refrigerant, which is like one of those super greenhouse gases
Yep.
and also punches a hole in the ozone layer. And that's an interesting environmental thing, in addition to just like the unsightliness of it, is that they're off gassing significant amounts in the aggregate of this horrible gas. And I think they switch to a different foaming agent or a different gas, but it's still like not that much better. And that happens a few years before they try to talk about recycling.
There had to be a point inside the company, and maybe they didn't talk about it among themselves, but where they were just like, oh, this is very like we can try to make this sound less worse, but we can't make this sound good.
Right.
Step one was, can we recycle this? And they were trying to educate, like McDonald's was trying to educate people on recycling.
Right. They're
Working
trying to do
with,
something good.
yeah, working with the World Wildlife Fund, the Smithsonian, the Royal Botanical Gardens. They produced an educational children's booklet called Weecology with the WWF.
Yeah, and to get myself like back in the headspace of late 80s environmentalism, I watched last night Sex, Lies, and Videotape with Andy McDowell and James Spader, just because the opening has Andy McDowell's character on the couch at a therapist's office talking about just the immense amounts of trash that like she's not even like in a particular place with a lot of trash, but she's talking about like it's everywhere. Where are we going to put it all? There's that barge called like the they called it the Gar barge that is just like it went from New York City down to Belize and back it was full of physical like waste, trash, looking for a place to dump it, and they couldn't find a place, and so it had to come back to New York City. Like this was like in the news in like in late 80s. We also had like acid rain. We had the hole in the ozone layer. And by comparison, all of these things today, for the most part, they're not the issue that they used to be. Acid rain is not the issue. The ozone layer is healing. We're in like a good place from the perspective of these like small concerns. Landfills,
We've moved on to other existential issues in terms of
which
like
are yes,
if
which
you
are
open
much more
Sex
like
Lies, yeah, if you open Sex Lies and Videotape now, it wouldn't be about garbage. It would be about all of these other current contemporary existential issues that would make somebody feel out of control in the world.
it would be about CO2, fossil fuels. It would be about like ocean trawling. It would be about strip mining and stuff that just comparatively to me anyways feels like so much harder to get a handle on. So much harder to say like, oh yeah, your recycling is gonna your individual contribution is gonna help here.
That feels like something that was clearly happening within the minds of the McDonald's leadership at the time as they looked at, okay, let's at least figure out how we recycle these things so we can say we're doing the right thing. And it's one of these
Right.
things where like the political move is the same as or seemingly the same as like what the environmentalists kind of want in this case. Like, yes, if we can recycle these, everyone's a little bit happier. Everyone's a little bit like, oh, we have to take on a little bit more cost, but they're kind of like trying to figure this out in terms of how to recycle it.
Here comes this case study.
The big twist in the case study is the EDF and McDonald's enter into this weird they create this task force. McDonald's is obviously very concerned about it all becoming regulated. Like there's these quotes from the New York mayor and the LA mayor, and I think there's a worry that if they don't get on top of this fast enough, it's going to get regulated. Which,
Right.
having just gone to McDonald's this morning in preparation of recording this, there was a sign that was like, because of California law, only like one set of utensils will be given when you order your food unless you ask for more.
And
Like,
from the perspective of McDonald's, like to have one, let's say New York City was they outlawed styrofoam in New York City. Well, now McDonald's has to figure out a new packaging thing anyways. And now they have to manage two packaging things. I can see why that they would just not want to do that.
yeah. So by
They
the
would much
late,
prefer to get ahead of it, do
Yep.
it on their own timeline, do it with paper lined plastic, as it turns out.
It talks about in the 89, 90, when they introduced recycling into the restaurants, this kind of like test case in New England with 450 restaurants. They created this plan to recycle the polystyrene plastic and the corrugated cardboard. They were already doing the recycling behind the scenes, which is also interesting. So we're just dealing with that like 7% of like waste at the restaurant, but they set up a way for people to actually be able to recycle after they purchased and ate in the restaurants.
Right.
And then this joint venture, they kind of had this plan for these plants to be put in operation by the National Polystyrene Recycling Company, a plastics industry joint venture. What I love about like this attempt is this like little pilot program. I mean, I guess it's a pretty big pilot program, 450 restaurants, but immediately pamphlets and posters explaining McDonald's rationale for the program, what customers need to do, and I'm sure all in this language of, we're recycling, we're doing everything.
Right. We're making a PVC billboard to advertise our recycling program. We're making 450 PVC billboards.
Yeah. But and then right away though, the environmentalists are referring to this as merely a public relations ploy. Like they basically like called their bluff right away. Like talking about how recycling overlooked the issue of pollutants generated by the production of all of these materials. And there's a great quote: recycling just serves to legitimize increasing the use of throwaway plastics. It would be far better for McDonald's to use durable goods instead of promoting the throwaway society.
Oh, this is Ralph Nader's group, right?
Yeah,
Right.
I love the idea of gonna have like actual plates and glassware.
And they talk about how there's a consumer at a McDonald's press release, who asks the question, why not have reusable plates and utensils? It's just like an awkward party foul. It's like, whoa, obviously, like we're not going to go there.
We're fast food. We're not a sit down dine-in restaurant. Like, let's not go crazy. So then a quick pivot into this joint task force on the environment. Did the reputation of the EDF suffer for this announcement? I remember in the 90s, there was always this thing of like, oh, if you work with the big company, you're bad.
From what I gather about the EDF is that they're sort of like you could call them moderate, you could call them pragmatic. I'm familiar with what you're talking about. This sort of sense of McDonald's is irredeemable, and to collaborate them with is to sort of abet them.
And then you had things like the Earth Liberation Front and things like that coming out of Oregon. If these big organizations are going to compromise and do harm reduction, we're going to go full radical eco-terrorism, spawned out the other side. And you sort of saw the separating of some of that into like the more radical fringe being like, oh, not only no compromise, but let's go full on burn down a building or something.
Blow up a pipeline. Yeah, it's today's version.
So they start this task force.
And this is, I guess, unimaginable that McDonald's would do this, or it's definitely newsworthy in the Harvard Business Review.
The goal of it it's different than the outcome. It says that McDonald's had already put in place numerous waste reduction initiatives, but the task force study would provide a framework, a systematic approach, and a strong scientific basis for McDonald's solid waste decisions. So they were really just studying the way that McDonald's was dealing with its waste.
So they eventually settle on they're going to use a polyethylene piece of plastic that's paper lined on both sides, and they're going to wrap the hamburger in that. And then 5 years later, they're back to cardboard boxes, which they were in the late 60s.
I think there was a lot of news around what a big deal this was in that they were working together, because I think it was very much business polluters on one side and sort of like environmentalists on the other. And so there was, Wall Street Journal articles, Boston Globe articles. Fred Krupp was quoted as saying, "It's hard to take me seriously when I say I'd like McDonald's to be garbage free. My dream is getting McDonald's to compost most of their waste and reduce the rest of it so they don't have any garbage." He still has radical visions.
That's my dream too.
He kind of, I think, also knows it's not going to happen. Okay, so the task force sort of, they set about developing this criteria. We know that McDonald's has this criteria of like everything has to be fast and efficient and all of these different kind of like business aspects. And this task force kind of created this new criteria where packaging decisions would also measure kind of the waste management hierarchy, as they called it, considering health, environmental impacts, feasibility, economic costs. So they added this new set of structures.
Right, which is the only
McDonald's.
way that businesses can like think of anything, it seems like, is to have like a metric and an objective and measurements and numbers.
Any collective group, because otherwise it's my individual opinion versus yours, unless we write it down into a framework, and then we can kind of share our thinking between, multiple people. This whole case study, which is 15, 16 pages, the very last page, we get into this note that, okay, by late October, it's 1990, nearly 3 months to the day after forming the partnership with the EDF, McDonald's is planning to expand its foam recycling program to all of its US restaurants. It's like, we figured it out, this is what we're going to do. And then out of nowhere, the company changed its mind, deciding to withdraw its foam sandwich boxes and dismantle its plastic recycling program. Poor Kenneth Harmon is probably so bummed. And they're going to move to quilted paper, which had been newly developed and tested during the summer in Cleveland. Right at the very end of this entire operation, they were like, nope, we're going to eject the whole thing.
Right.
And Yastro is quoted as saying, "The last 4, 5, or 6 days around here were very intense about whether we should make the change."
So Fred Krupp had his teeth in them, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, and I think he got Renzi on board. Renzi was the big man.
Renzi is flexible, as we know.
He's the COO, He actually went on to become the CEO and is credited with the development of the chicken nugget. But him and Ed and Fred, they're the ones that did it. Ed Renzi and Fred Krupp. Even as the rest of the organization was heading towards this recycling, they were just like, nope, we're doing it another way. And then the entire case study ends right there. They introduce this abrupt change in this whole thing about polystyrene recycling and all of these different players, and it ends on kind of all these questions. McDonald's had to position how McDonald's was going to position its announcement, and it's like, how should it address the public, the press, other audiences, shareholders? What would the key messages be? How should they talk about
this is for the Harvard Business School students? Maybe this is the point of a case study where it gets into the questions, the what would you do's.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that the form that we're dealing with? Yeah.
It feels like it, because it ends on this cliffhanger of, and now what, ... What should it make of the recent statement from a scientist at the National Audubon Society? Using a lot more paper means a lot more pollution. It is a mistake to make plastic the great Satan and paper the great saint. Both processes generate pollution.
Wow.
That's the end of the whole case study.
What would you do, Mike, if you were COO or CEO of McDonald's at this time? How would you?
I would position it as, we worked with the EDF in order to create a solution that was satisfactory to everyone. But in the end, McDonald's decided to go a step further and eliminate the use of this toxic material, whatever. No, maybe I'll say toxic.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So then it makes it look like McDonald's went above and beyond what the EDF decided to do. That'd be my, like, how to position it.
That's very good. Yeah.
One would assume that McDonald's and the Environment case study B addresses some of this, but this case study ends on this strange note.
Perhaps if we have another podcast episode, this is something we can delve into.
After reading through this, what were the parts that landed for you the most or were the most interesting or fascinating?
Just a different mental climate back then of what environmentalism was and what was needed. And also trying to put myself in the place where this sort of third way collaboration between the environmental group and the corporation is fresh and believable. If somebody told me that like Walmart was pairing with like the World Wildlife Foundation today to do something along these lines, I would be like, all right. It's hard to imagine that this being really like all that exciting.
Yeah, I think I did read that Fred Krupp went on to work with Walmart to get LED lighting installed, and that was also a huge harm reduction win versus energy or waste or some kind of thing as well. So it's interesting that you brought up Walmart and
yeah, I think that's
and the environment. Yeah, I agree. We have this term greenwashing now, and we understand it in a way where
right.
We just don't buy it. We don't buy that there's no true desire from the part of the company. And that's the question mark I have, is how bought in was Ed Renzi, the COO of McDonald's? How bought into this idea was he versus how much was he just trying to solve the problem for McDonald's?
Right. And I think that's apparent because if I think about like McDonald's doing environmentalism thing today, it would be all of the beef, all of the hog farming and the chicken farming.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff that seems a lot more baked into McDonald's core offering than the packaging even. And I think that's why, like if something were announced that were to do something on those fronts, that would be novel to me. That would be shocking. I can't imagine that really.
And it's such a wildly different media landscape now, trying to get a message out about your changes towards either harm reduction or a more positive environmental spin of a giant company. Like, who would care? You'd have to do something so massive now in order to get that done, in order to make anyone care about it.
Yeah, it would just be like a TikTok video about like backpackers who also love to go to McDonald's when they're done with their backpacking. It's like these things are compatible, and there wouldn't even be a message. I think when they figure out, hopefully, or continue rolling out the McPlant sandwich, that'll be an exciting time to see how they frame that.
I think another huge issue is, worker rights unionization.
Oh yeah.
Which is sort of another like modern day issue in fast
Starbucks
food.
is dealing with it poorly.
Has there been any news recently about McDonald's that you've
let's run the numbers, shall we?
Yeah, let's look at it.
The stock price $267.20 as of market close on Friday. We've got a new McDonald's Chief Development Officer, Tabassum Zalotrawala. It looks like she was hired. They announced the job on Thursday. She's coming from Chipotle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's new. That's exciting. She looks like she's had some heavy hitter success in her career. And also the bagel sandwich. The bagel is back on the East Coast as a breakfast option instead of a biscuit or the McGriddle.
I was really excited to try it, even though I'm a diehard bacon, egg, cheese, biscuit fan for my morning sandwich at McDonald's. They didn't have it in LA yet, so it has not rolled out nationwide.
I enjoyed it. It's got more tooth than any other breakfast sandwich from McDonald's. And I think it's sort of funny that New York City is like one of the first places and in my neighborhood, it's the most efficient place to get a bagel now.
I mean, that makes sense. That's their whole game. I was shocked this morning at how fast it was to get my food at the drive-thru.
It's addictive. It's like the news site that loads in your browser in less than a second.
Yes.
It's like, oh, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to McDonald's.
Yeah, fast food, fast culture.
I think this is the time for our outro.
All right. Well, that's the pilot episode of Hamburger Business Review. We are going to see if we can get a series order of, I think, 8 to 10 episodes. This is also already one of my most profitable projects. We've been paid $5 by our first supporter.
That's like a 5x increase, probably.
Oh, infinite increase, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, when the denominator is zero.
Yeah. So we're doing really well.
What else do we have on tap for Harvard Business Review case studies of McDonald's?
I mean, I'll run through some of these titles just to give people a taste. I mean, one I'm really excited about was the 2005 Golden Arch Hotel, McDonald's adventure in the hotel industry. McDonald's, Wendy's, and hedge funds, hamburger hedging.
Ooh.
McDonald's, the Arch Deluxe launch. There's a lot to dig into, and I think what's fun about McDonald's is and what we found is it touches on everything. And then there's also this underlying kind of like Game of Thrones style action happening underneath at all times. And I was looking at CEOs and the COOs leaving under mysterious circumstances. I'm personally fascinated by Hamburger University, and I want to know more about that. So there's a lot going on
Join us again next time
on Hamburger Business Review.